Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I am your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's frontline. Joining us this week is award-winning veteran climate and environmental reporter and podcaster, Amy Westervelt. Amy is the executive producer of the independent podcast production company, Critical Frequency, which focuses on narrative-style podcasts. Season 2 of the series This Land, which Amy led the reporting and production teams of, was nominated for a Peabody Award in April of 2022. She joins me today to talk about the 8th season of another one of her series called Drilled, which was awarded the Online News Association Award for Excellence in Audio Journalism in 2019 and Covering Climate Now's Award for Excellence in Audio Journalism in 2021. Today, Amy talks about the 8th season on Drilled, which explores the recent oil boom in the nation of Guyana and the environmental, social, and economic impacts of this recent development. She also shares with me what she feels about the state of the world's response to climate change and also the status of environmental and climate news reporting. Amy, thanks for joining me today. It's great to have you on the Mongabay Newscast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, a lot of people already know your work, but can you give our listeners a bit of background on, what drew you to journalism and, how you got into climate change and the fossil fuel beat and also how your podcast began?
Yes. So I I actually got into climate reporting in kind of a roundabout way. I was freelance writing. I had left a staff magazine job and I was freelancing, and I was not a very good freelancer. So I, was like staring down the barrel of like 2 weeks till rent was due, and I didn't know how I was going to pay it. And a friend of mine was working at an engineering firm, and he's like, well, actually, we have this, we need someone to write up some case studies for us. It's really boring, but they pay like as soon as each one's done, and they're really fast, and they'll pay you well, and whatever. I was like, great, I'm in. So I ended up writing up a case study for them on work that they had done to help Shell re-engineer offshore oil platforms for sea level rise. And it was like a fairly old, it was like they'd done this work in the late 90s at some point. And I was like, wait a minute, I don't think Shell was even really acknowledging that, the seas were going to be rising by that point. So I did a little bit of digging around, and sure enough, they were not. And so I wrote a little story on that, and it kind of got me hooked on just this whole beat of what the oil companies were doing on climate change and when, and all of that. So that was sort of my entry into climate journalism. And then on the podcast front, I want to say maybe like 2010, 2011, I was driving around and I was listening to NPR, and I was having like FOMO. I was like, oh, I wish I could do audio. And I thought, well, I bet there's a member station around here that I could, volunteer at to learn. And so I got in touch with my local NPR station, which at the time was Reno Public Radio, and offered my email subject line was, would you like an old intern? And they were like, actually, it takes us a lot longer to like train people on the reporting side than on, sort of how to use audio equipment. So yeah, come on in. So I interned for about a month, and then I got a job there as a staff reporter, which is great because I had never really done community reporting, and Reno is like a wild community to report on. It's a very interesting place. And at the time, it was like the Gigafactory was being built, and Tesla was getting in there in a big way. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff around public lands there and indigenous rights and all of that. So I got a lot of experience doing audio and, reporting on that community. And I realized that for every 4-minute news feature that you hear on NPR, there's like hours of tape that someone has been gathering in the background that never gets used. And a lot of that stuff is really interesting. So a friend of mine at that station and I started a podcast with basically all of our kind of leftover tape. We were like, there's so many interesting characters here and so many stories. And so we started that in, I want to say like 2016, maybe 2015. And that kind of gave me the podcast bug. I was like, this is such a fun medium. And the whole time I was doing audio, I was trying to think of, what would be a good narrative climate podcast, because there weren't any at the time. All of the climate podcasts were like interview shows. There was no like This American Lifestyle storytelling on climate issues, which I thought was weird because there's so many stories to be told. But once I started trying to think of one, I was like, oh, this is why it's actually hard to think of like a way to frame it. And then I got this assignment to cover some of the early climate liability cases. So I was in a courtroom in San Francisco. This judge had ordered a climate science tutorial, and he basically wanted to know, what the state of climate science had been at various points in history. And I was like, oh, this is it. I'm going to do a true crime show about climate change. Like, all the characters are here. There's like this eccentric judge and these really slick oil company lawyers and like activists in their Exxon new t-shirts and, all of that stuff. So, and it's like a framework that's very familiar to people, true crime, but also courtroom stuff. It's like there's two sides. There's all of this like documentation involved. You're hearing from multiple voices, all of that stuff. So that's how I ended up starting Drilled in 2017. And I was only going to do one season. I was going to do like a limited run series. And then halfway through, I was like, oh, I kind of want to do, I don't want to do another season on this lawsuit that these fishermen are bringing. And then I kind of want to do something on, the PR industry and their role and all of this stuff. So now we're on season 8, and I have like 3 more at least, and who knows how many more after that.
Yeah, and we're going to touch upon that and give our listeners here like a preview of what season 8 is about. Before we get into that, though, I was wondering, can you like talk a little bit about where you feel the U.S. and the world is right now with climate change and the response to it? Because we're like passing a lot of key thresholds, and there's these landmark commitments, and corporations and governments still seem to be kind of taking like this business as usual approach, despite the negative impacts to biodiversity. So
I think we're going the wrong way really quickly. It's terrible. Like, you see, there was a lot of hoopla about the Willow Project in the US in the last few months, for good reason. But even beyond the Willow Project, the US alone has okayed several major oil and gas projects. Biden had this whole agreement with the EU that's locking in gas for the next 10 years at least. US gas companies are using Russia, Ukraine to secure 20, 30-year contracts on gas. Even though, by the way, like most European countries are still heavily importing Russian gas. So that's actually increased in the last year, despite all of these stories of like, oh, we need more gas everywhere else because Europe has a shortfall because they're not using Russian gas. That's only true of 2 countries in Europe, and it's not the big ones. So, there's a huge push in the global South to get not only fossil fuel development off the ground, but also to make sure that people in those countries are, the next wave of people who are hooked on fossil fuels. It's very much like kind of a repeat of what we've seen with tobacco and with cars, where as soon as the global north starts to, move on to something else, we like to dump stuff on the global south. That's happening with fossil fuels now. So we're in a bad place. I don't mean to be a doomer, there's definitely there's time to do something, and we know what needs to be done. Right. That hasn't changed in the last 5 years, but we're not doing it. Governments are not doing it. Somehow we have, in the global north, have left the global south dependent on oil companies to pay for climate adaptation. That's insane. So yeah, there's a real need to actually do what's necessary. And honestly, I sometimes I get accused of villainizing the oil companies too much or focusing on them too much or whatever. But I think that they have had an enormous amount of power. And I think that we're not going to allow governments to act until we kick those companies out of, policy discussions, international climate treaty discussions. The next conference of the parties is happening in an oil state and is completely, a lobbying event for the fossil fuel industry. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I was really interested to hear about that. So then, on the other hand, can you tell us what's your opinion like then about the state of climate change reporting and environmental news in general? Is there anything you feel that's like underreported at the moment currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that climate reporting has improved a lot in the last 5 years, even. There's more of it. Unfortunately, a lot of newsrooms have cut back on investigative reporting because it's the most expensive kind, right? And that's too bad because there's a lot of stuff going on that needs to be kind of ferreted out. I also think that a lot of publications are like sort of give lip service to wanting stories from the global south, but haven't done a great job of actually like letting people from the global south tell those stories. There's still a lot of parachute journalism happening. There's a lot of like, big international outlets kind of setting this framework and then everyone else like responding to it. But I do think that it's improved a lot. There's a lot more climate reporters now. There is the possibility for a lot of people to do independent reporting. There's a lot of independent outlets that have launched in the last, 3 to 5 years, including like, some of the newsletters like Heated. There's a new project from a few people that kind of decamped from the Atlantic and other places called Heat Map that's doing some really interesting reporting. There's what's the other one? Semaphore, which, unfortunately has decided to go big on fossil fuel ads to support their climate reporting. But there are like several new outlets that are covering climate as well. The flip side of that is a lot of the major outlets have said, oh, we're going to really commit to this beat and we're going to have a climate vertical and whatever. And then that ends up being like a newsletter and some opinion pieces, which, that stuff's fine. We need those things too. It's good to, sort of humanize climate, and there are lots of stories to be told. But I do think that I would like to see more outlets investing in, kind of hard-nosed journalism too.
Yeah, it's hard to do. So then let's talk about your new season on Drilled here.
Yeah.
It's season 8. And this series is for listeners who are unfamiliar. This is a very acclaimed series. Can you tell our listeners what it's about exactly, and what it's exploring? Like what's happening down there in Guyana?
Well, it's really interesting because Guyana for years has been like a big ecotourism destination, and they sort of like worked really hard to develop lots of models for the ecotourism industry and had been trying to win this award from. There's this like big travel show in Berlin every year that like names the top ecotourism destination in the world, and in 2019. Guyana finally like won that honor, and it happened to also be the same year that they started shipping barrels of oil. So there's this really interesting moment happening there where, Exxon and Shell went in there in 1999 kind of looking for oil, mostly because Venezuela was becoming hard to deal with and they weren't sure what was going to happen there. So they're like looking at all of its neighbors, right? And then in 2008, they started exploring offshore in earnest. Didn't find anything right off the bat. Shell took off. Exxon brought in CNOOC, the Chinese national oil company, and Hess, which is like an independent. They're actually like a big fracking company in the US. And in 2015, made this announcement that they had found, billions of barrels of oil offshore in Guyana. So they inked a new contract with the government there, and they started working on producing barrels. They started shipping their first barrels in 2019, and now they're on track to be Exxon's top producer, which is enormous. In 3 to 5 years, they've gone from no industry at all to outpacing even Exxon's Texas holdings on production. And that's really interesting for a few reasons. One, it's like, as the world is trying to transition off of fossil fuels, we have this whole huge new development happening, and they're fast tracking it. They're really trying to get as much oil out of the ground and sold as quickly as they can. And in a place like Guyana that doesn't have a big history of fossil fuels, they don't really have the capacity to be doing the kind of oversight necessary for an offshore project that's that big. So you constantly hear Exxon saying, oh, we've done in 5 years what usually takes us 10 years there. And, I'm like, okay, well, there's not really any new technology. They're not drilling in any new different, there's nothing that's new except an almost total lack of oversight.
Right.
And in a situation like this, where you're 40 miles offshore, you're drilling in deep water, it's super high risk. There's a lot of people that are like, geez, this sounds an awful lot like the deep water situation. And except that you're in a place that is not surrounded by a bunch of like rapid response oil spill teams. And it's in this incredibly important center of biodiversity. They're, one of like the biggest carbon sinks in the world, which is also interesting. They're kind of using that to be like, well, it's okay for us to drill for oil because we're a massive carbon sink, and also we're a small country, so we don't emit that much, so everybody should get off our back about this oil thing, right? But that doesn't account for where those barrels are being shipped and the emissions associated with that. Nor does it take into account the fact that a massive oil spill would dramatically impact all of the things that enable Guyana to be a carbon sink as well. So it's just this really interesting moment, because a lot of the arguments that the government makes around, these being their resources and therefore their right to exploit them as they wish, and the need for money for development and the need for, stable energy supplies, these are all things that we've been grappling with for a long time. This idea of like, how do you solve poverty and climate at the same time? How do you address energy poverty and not exacerbate emissions? All of that stuff. And this is, there again, like Guyana was like one of the first countries to participate in the REDD+ program. They got all of this money from Norway to preserve their forests. Now they're the first country to participate in the REDD Trees program, which is sort of a like carbon market for global South countries that are carbon sinks, to sort of sell those carbon credits to companies. One of the oil companies involved is actually now paying for carbon credits in this weird like pyramid scheme that is carbon offsets. So it's, but there again, I'm like, how, like, you can't really, I don't think that anyone is really looking at it and going, oh, these officials in Guyana shouldn't be doing this. It's sort of like, this is the situation that this country has been put in, where they don't really have a lot of options. And they were like the poster child for, global North payments to global South for biodiversity conservation and carbon sink services and all of this stuff. So like, if it's been pretty much a failure there, then, I think there's like, it's a good example of how much more needs to be done at the international level around this stuff.
Yeah. Something that I found really interesting in the episode, I hope I'm not spoiling this for anyone, is that while you were en route to Guyana, you actually called and found out that your hotel had been canceled. And I was just kind of, I was like, okay, can you talk to our listeners? What was that about?
Yes. So this is not the first time this has happened to me. It's like almost every time I report any story around Exxon that requires travel, all my travel plans get canceled. So this happened when the first season of Drilled, I went and talked to a bunch of former Exxon scientists on the East Coast, and the same thing happened then. Like my flight got canceled, my hotel rooms were all canceled, my car was canceled, all this stuff. I for legal reasons, I can't say for sure that it's Exxon, but it only really happens when I'm reporting on them. And they do kind of have a history of this, of like trying to sort of just intimidate journalists to back off. So yeah, it happened when I was waiting for my flight to Georgetown, and I got a call that or I got a message that my hotel had been canceled. And Georgetown is not really the kind of place that you can just show up and get a hotel last minute. So it was like, oh, great. Like kind of quickly, I'm like boarding the plane, calling hotels, and sorted it out. But yeah. And there was other stuff that happened when we were there too. Guyana is an interesting place right now because the oil company and the government are kind of one and the same at the moment. So it's not super safe for people who are critical of the project. They are kind of under an international microscope at the moment, so that provides some level of security. But it's not uncommon for journalists or activists to kind of be harassed there. So that's another component to it. Like, I don't know, I feel like reporters in the US and Europe don't really have to deal with that as much as reporters in a lot of global South countries who, have to be really extra careful about what they're doing and how public they are and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah. Something else I found really interesting in the episode is how you kind of describe like this metamorphosis of Georgetown from, having previous economic models to suddenly becoming this oil boom town,
Yeah.
around that time. And then I believe you say in the episode that Guyana's current president sort of justifies the oil money, saying that it would help pay for the clean energy transition. And
That's exactly right. Yeah.
I found that just very interesting. Can you comment more on that?
Yeah, that's exactly they've been talking about that. Even the oil companies talk about it, about how they're basically funding Guyana's low carbon transition, which is wild,
Yeah,
wild. Doesn't make a lot of logical sense. And I should point out too that Guyana is a country very much on the front lines of the climate crisis. Their 90% of their population lives on the coast in a strip of land that is projected to be underwater by 2030, not 2050, not 2030, which is 7 years from now, which means that they're going to have to move 90% of the population. And some of what they've been discussing is, basically like using oil money to be able to do that. But it's this weird situation where, it's sort of, they're doing the thing that will exacerbate that problem. And that's the thing that's going to give them the money to deal with. Again, I look at that and I think, what a total failure of international climate negotiations that global South countries are relying on, the ones that have fossil fuel resources are in this position of having to use oil money to pay for climate adaptation. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. But that's the thing. It's like, well, if you want global South countries to develop along a different pathway, then there needs to be some effort made to make that happen. There needs to be investments in renewable energy technology and distribution. There needs to be total rethinking of development financing, like a new look at how we valued biodiversity and carbon sinks and all of that stuff. Right now, there's just like not that many other options for them. And also the other thing is, the real danger in Guyana is that like all the stuff they're doing to fast track oil money could destroy all of their other economic sectors, which are agriculture, tourism, and fishing. So
it's wild.
Yeah, but it's pretty, like, that's the story in that entire region. For the most part, you've got Suriname right next door, where Total and Shell are doing the same thing. You've got Barbados, where Mia Mottley has been this huge climate champion. They're having an oil auction as we speak, auctioning off offshore oil blocks. Guyana's doing the same. They're going to auction off more blocks this month. I think in part because they've been getting a lot of flack from both citizens and international critics around the structure of the contract that they have with Exxon, which, like, you know, the president keeps saying they're going to get rich off of this and use this money to do all these things, but everyone who's looked at the contract is sort of like, I don't think that payday is actually ever going to come for you guys, because Exxon has structured it in such a way that, like, they front load their profits and then sort of leave Guyana with the dregs later on.
Well, that's a lot to take in. I mean, I think
I'm really fun at parties.
Well, if anyone's interested, there's plenty of episodes that are released right now. I highly recommend that you all go and check it out. So Amy, can I ask you, like, what kind of impact or response have you seen to your podcast series? I mean, you've got on 8 seasons now. What's the response been like?
Yeah, well, a couple things. One, I think that there's been like a huge explosion in other people kind of adopting this true crime framework around climate. I think it's been like a helpful narrative framing for a lot of folks. So there's been like documentaries and verticals in different outlets and all of that are kind of like looking at this as, oh, this is actually a crime. This is like a fraud that's been perpetrated on the public, and, you know, all of this kind of stuff. The other kind of, I guess, response, or I guess, I don't know, impact, is just that we have managed to dig up quite a few primary documents that have made their way into various climate lawsuits and also congressional and Senate hearings. So that's been good to see. I think in Guyana, there has been actually, so like we've been working with a newspaper and a radio station on the ground there to share our reporting, and that's been helpful, I think, to kind of educate the public about, you know, what's going on, what the potential for harm there is, all of that. We've gotten, because we cover so many court cases, and in this case, I should say too, that in the Guyana season, there's a lawyer there who's brought now 7 cases trying to kind of slow down or stop the oil drilling there. And I've gotten lots of emails from lawyers looking to connect with other lawyers in other parts of the world. So like kind of connecting those people up together has been great, you know, or activists who were like, oh, this strategy that we heard about in, you know, such and such season is really interesting to us. Can you put us in touch with that lawyer or that economist or, you know, this academic researcher or whatever? So actually, like, weirdly, we've done a lot of matchmaking between people who are, you know, finding out about things through the podcast and then want to connect with the experts that they've heard from there. And then audience-wise, you know, we have about like 200,000 listeners, which is great. And that's growing all the time. We have a co-publishing agreement with The Guardian now, so that's helping with getting some of the reporting into print as well. Because as you know, like audio, you can only get so much in.
It's a challenge.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at now. And right now we're in the process of building out to do more cross-border stories. So one thing that I've been realizing, the last couple of things that I've been reporting on, is that, you know, these are global companies, right? They operate around the world. Climate change is a global issue, and we tend to cover a lot of these things in kind of siloed ways where it's like, you know, just about what's happening in one country or one region. And whenever I talk to reporters that are working on similar stories in other places, we always find really interesting connections between the two. So I've got a reporter in Australia now. We're hiring someone in Latin America and in Africa, Canada, Europe, and the US to work on some stuff together to see, like, okay, how are certain, you know, litigation trends spreading or legislative trends. Like, we're looking at the enormous increase in anti-protest laws that the fossil fuel industry has been backing, not just in the US, but like in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, all over the place. So yeah, being able to kind of connect those dots more is fun, and I think we're going to be doing more of it this year.
Um, as, as a podcaster myself, who
Yeah,
works on deep dive environmental stories, I really appreciate your attention to like sound design, and I realize that it's like a ton of work to do, and I
yeah.
think that you'll do it particularly well on Drilled. So I was kind of curious if you, for other reporters or journalists out there who are like thinking of starting a show,
Yeah.
who may or may not know what to do to start with sound design, what would be like the biggest takeaway or essential tip that you have for them?
I think the biggest thing is to always be gathering sound. There's so much stuff that we end up using that like I never would have thought about ahead of time. And I've just kind of gotten in the habit of like always be recording all the time, even when you're like packing your bag to go on a reporting trip or you're walking through the airport or whatever. Like there's so much stuff that helps to like put listeners in the place that you're taking them to. So I think that to me is the biggest thing. Like we always end up with like many, many hours of, scene tape or ambient sound that like doesn't get used, but it's worth it to have that stuff so that when we have a really great sound designer too, who Martin Zaltz Oswick, he's great. He also like writes music. So he's like that amazing person who can be like putting together an episode and be like, oh, there needs to be transitional music here. I'll just make something, which is like amazing. But we try to get a lot of like, like ocean sounds and market sounds and just a lot of that like ambient sound that helps to kind of place listeners in a context.
I'm taking notes. So are there any hopeful trends that you're witnessing regarding climate and environment reporting? Here at Mongabay, we cover like solutions like reforestation, agroforestry, and
Yeah.
agroecology. Do you focus on solutions like that much in your work?
Yeah, I think that I feel like the solutions that we focus on are more around accountability. So like, litigation, for example, that could bring about money to fund things like reforestation and such, or really new approaches to policy or law that could really shift like how we're making these decisions. So for example, we did a whole season on rights of nature, excuse me, which I'm kind of obsessed with at the moment because it's like it's a legal concept that gives ecosystems rights and then therefore gives the communities around those ecosystems the ability to legally protect those ecosystems, which in places like the United States, where private property is a really big, sacrosanct thing, actually like is very much needed, because otherwise, like a company can come in and pollute your water source as long as they have the right property rights and permits, right? So I think like I don't know, I like we looked at rights of nature all around the world and like how it can provide just a different decision making framework and sort of place different values at the center of how we make decisions about how society works. So like in Ecuador, for example, they had this huge case last year. It was the first case that the Supreme Court had heard on rights of nature, which is part of their constitution. It was called the Los Cedros case, and it was about a cloud forest where they were doing mining. And the president of Ecuador was like, it's okay because it's like all about electrify everything. It's like mining for the stuff we need for electrification, so it's fine. And the courts were like, no, it's not fine, which I think is so helpful because there is this danger right now of taking the same approach that has been taken with fossil fuels into electrification and winding up with a lot of the same problems because we're using the same kind of decision-making framework. So we've been focusing a lot on like, okay, what are other ways to make these decisions? What are ways that we can, electrify, but also reduce energy consumption so that we're not just like replicating this enormous amount of consumption over and over again. Yeah.
So I was just kind of curious. Do you have any role models or heroes or icons that you go to for inspiration or any information
Yes.
in your work?
Yes, tons. I would say Jane Mayer, who wrote Dark Money and is a reporter for The New Yorker, kind of constantly digging into corporate influence over government policy. Lisa Graves, who was a former Senate researcher who then went on to run the Center for Media and Democracy, and now she runs a separate research entity. She's like a freaking genius when it comes to just like finding things. And I don't know, just she's like the person I always want to talk to about weird things I've seen that don't make sense to me yet. She's like, oh yeah, okay, here's what's going on, you know?
Yeah.
Who else? I would say, well, Mariana East Hegler, who I worked with on a show called Hot Take for a long time. I always go to her for insight on like broader climate justice issues. Rihanna Gunn-Wright too, like huge, just like, again, total genius when it comes to policy and climate justice. Tamara Tolzo Laughlin, who ran 350 North America for a while and now is working on a bunch of different things in the sort of like climate and litigation and climate justice space. I like pick her brain about climate reparations and international climate policy a lot. Those are like the top ones, but there's so many, like there's honestly so many people doing really amazing work in the climate space. And like, I think that gives me, you know, some optimism when I look at the numbers and I'm just like, oh, we're going the wrong way. Rebecca Solnit too, like she's been so, she's such an amazing writer, and it's been great to see her like focus almost entirely on the climate space in the last couple of years. She's always been involved in climate stuff, but you know, she's been really focused on it in recent years. And then there's a group of people doing some amazing work in Mexico right now. El Tema. The project is called El Tema, but they've done a bunch of video shorts. It's Pablo Montaño, and he works with Gael Garcia Bernal, and they're doing like amazing docu-series, but also just really interesting community outreach work in Mexico to kind of meet people where they are and work through a lot of there's, you know, Mexico's an interesting situation because they have a national oil company, Pemex, that's like a really big part of the national identity there. So even people who kind of might be on board with environmental protections are like, whoa, don't criticize Pemex, you know? So yeah. They've been like a real inspiration. Like they did this fascinating project in one of the coal mining towns in Mexico. They have a lot of like company towns in Mexico that were built by coal companies that very intentionally left a lot of like didn't design the towns the way that most towns are designed in Mexico, you know, like they're usually organized around a square, and there's like the church is right next to the government building, and you know, there's reasons for that. Like people meet and they talk about stuff, and you know, there's a way to influence the local government, and the companies didn't really want that, so they built things like really far away. There's no square, there's no like community gathering space, and so they started to go into these towns, and some of the organizers there were like, don't talk to these people about climate because they don't trust climate people. They think that climate people are like shutting down their business. And, you know, the reason that like their town is depressed is because coal is gone, and that's the climate people's fault, right? And they're also like, where were you guys when, you know, our husbands and brothers were dying from black lung down the mine, you know?
Yeah.
So they went in and they, you know, spent a bunch of time getting to know people in the town without pushing anything on them, and started a community garden project because they're like, there's no gathering place in this town. There's all of these women who are widows, who are like kind of the elders of the town and very well respected, you know? And so they started working with them to start a community garden that's not only growing food, but also like, you know, a lot of medicinal plants and stuff, and people will come to this garden and these women for advice on like, what, you know, I have indigestion, what should I take or whatever. And that built so much like goodwill that then they could sort of start to talk to them about some of the climate stuff. And I think it's a really interesting model, and I think something that a lot of like US climate activists could learn a lot from. It's like, actually becoming part of the community in a helpful and productive way before you start trying to push certain like policy changes and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Amy, where can people find you online if they want some updates or regular updates? And where can they find your podcast?
The podcast is everywhere. We do have a website, drilledpodcast.com for now, although I don't know, we're working on like updating that. But drilledpodcast.com, you can find the podcast, and we have a weekly newsletter. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Amy Westervelt. And then also on Mastodon, because Twitter has become such a giant mess. Yeah. So yeah, I'm in all of those places. I'm easy to find.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. And it's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's been fun.
If you want to check out Amy's work, please see links to her latest season of Drilled provided here in the show notes, or find her on Twitter and Mastodon at Amy Westervelt. As always, if you enjoy the Mongabay Newscast, we ask that you help spread the word by telling a friend, because that is the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. But if you want, you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Did you know that we are a non-profit? Even just $1 per month will really help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can always read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, find Mongabay on most of the social platforms from facebook.com to TikTok, Instagram, Mastodon, and others. And as always, thanks for listening.